Hi, everyone. This is Dorie Clark, and I am here with Newsweek's weekly interview show, Better. Today's guest, I'm very excited, is Professor Rob Cross. He teaches at Babson University, and he is the author of this new book, Beyond Collaboration Overload. We all have been taught and learned that collaboration is a fantastic thing, but as Rob Cross will tell us, maybe not always, and maybe not in every circumstance. So I'm excited to learn more and especially excited to welcome all of you here. If you are tuning in live, please type your name into the chat box and let us know where you are calling in from. We'd love to hear from you and also to take your questions for Rob Cross. So Rob, welcome. Great to have you here.
It's a huge treat to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So, Rob, the first question on my mind, I think this is probably true for everyone. We have been taught since we were little kids. I remember I had team projects. Oh, and this is training us for the workforce. This is training us to be better collaborators. I thought that this was supposed to be the highest and best use of humankind. What happened? Why are we overloaded with collaboration?
That's fine. That's a great question. And so for me, a lot of times when people hear the word collaboration, of course, the knee-jerk reaction is always more is better, right? It's a great thing. It's like motherhood, apple pie. It's just more, is better. And of course, that conception of being a good team member, working in teams is a great thing, right? What I got interested in, though, is looking at my consortium members where we're actually going out and mapping who's interacting with whom. And sometimes looking at groups of a couple thousand up to groups of 50, 60, 80,000 for looking at large organizational issues, was not the small team collaborations, but rather the fact that when you start looking at how much time people spend on the phone, on email, on videos, on IM, on team collaborative packages, other places like that, really across almost 9 platforms on average that most organizations are having people work across, that they're spending about 85% of their week in that. And that was pre-pandemic. As we've gone through the pandemic, that number's gone up 5 to 8 hours. People are working deeper into the night and earlier in the morning just to keep up. And so that's what I got worried about, right? Not the small team collaborations, but rather the fact that the volume and the intensity of these collaborative demands has risen to a point that I could see, some roles and a lot of people were really struggling to keep up.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine that during the pandemic, especially, we have hit epic proportions of collaboration overload. So I want to say hi to some of the great folks who are tuning in. We're glad to have you here. We have Yasmina from Paris. We have Karen from San Francisco. Greg's here from La Jolla. We've got Maricia here, I think, from Poland. This is great. We've got Nabila from Delhi. We've got Ting from Gothenburg, Sweden. Karen from Boston. We're so glad to have all of you here. And if you have questions for Professor Rob Cross, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. We're talking beyond collaboration overload. So, Rob, you were alluding to this a little bit. I am curious, during the pandemic, one of the challenges when we're remote, that seems to be a big issue because we're collaborating in different ways. We may be collaborating in some ways more, but it's less organic. We're not bumping into each other exactly. We've got all kinds of different platforms which can sometimes confuse the matter. What do we need to do as we think about distance and as we think about just all of the channels? Are there a few ways that we can streamline this process somehow or avoid getting so burned out?
Yeah, I think it really has less to do with channels and technology and more to do with intentionality of how we're living things. So I'll tell you, one of the things that I got really shocked by about 6-8 weeks into the pandemic, I was part of these broad surveys that go out to hundreds and hundreds of organizations for the different commercial vendors. And they would allow me to put some questions in. And one of the questions I put in was, what are you learning from this experience? Just very last question, open-ended question. Normally you do that, nobody answers, right? You get like 2 pages of responses. And in this case, we were getting back hundreds and hundreds of pages. And they were really incredibly thoughtful and detailed. And they took 2 very different spins. One was, this is wonderful. Like, I don't have my commute. I've got 2.5 hours of my life back. I'm eating better. My children like me. My significant other's talking to me, sleeping more, kind of all the positive things. But then almost identically in the reverse direction, about 50% of them were saying, oh my gosh, where did my commute go? right? I don't, that was the only time I had to think, things are killing me. What do I do? How's this going to get me better? And the reality in my mind for that second group of people is it wasn't really the commute, right? It was that they gave up control of the situation, and they didn't kind of hold on to certain things that were critical to them and push back. And so I think throughout all of this, whether we talk about the pandemic or how we move into this remote work context, one of the hearts of it is the intentionality that we take to this and shaping the context versus becoming, subsumed by it in different ways. So let me pause there. I've got a couple specific things too related to the pandemic, but let me pause on that one. And
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you. And I think that your focus on intentionality is right, because it's so true. Two different people faced with the exact same situation at work or with regard to their commute, with regard to how folks are adapting to the pandemic, can be responding in very different ways. So I think that's really important. We have new folks tuning in. Togi's here from Bangalore. Janet's here from Syracuse. We're so happy to have all of you and more. We're here with Professor Rob Cross. His book is Beyond Collaboration Overload. So, Rob, let's dig in more. You gave us some hints here.
Teaser, yeah.
you get the teaser about pandemic collaboration observations. What do we need to know? What have you taken from all this?
Well, I mean, one of the problems that we're experiencing, it's greater stress on us, right? In part because we're working longer. But the other thing that's happened, there are two things really. One is we've tried to jam more into existing days. So rather than 8 one-hour meetings, we're trying to do 16 30-minute meetings and assume that that's going to kind of handle the situation. And what that does is, of course, it requires more of us in those 30 minutes, right? Because we have to be more intense, more focused. We're switching across topics more quickly, which consumes us, as well. And then you end the day with a to-do list, not based on 8 meetings, but 16. Right. And so just mathematically, we're working harder as we go through all this. And people have kind of experienced that, right? And all the other things that are happening. What I think is missed a lot of times that I could see in a lot of these interviews we just finished on well-being was the degree to which not only did the stress rise, but because of the social distancing, most people were pulled out of the groups outside of work that kept them whole. And what I can see as we really look at as people progress, there's a strong tendency, kind of particularly mid to late 30s, to fall out of groups that kind of keep us happy and whole. And these can be book clubs, athletic pursuits, religious organizations, but they're usually 2 or 3 that kind of create identity for us that makes us broader than work. And as life gets busy, sometimes mid to late 30s, you see people falling out of them, and you get more and more unidimensional in work. So the stress of work becomes magnified too. And it's really the combination of those things, right? Is thinking about kind of how do you, hopefully reinvest in those as we come out of the pandemic, move back into to remote work, is one really critical thing I think that matters for us as we go.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and salient point. And so just to drill into collaboration and what this looks like, I know in your book, you have an interesting statistic. You talk about the fact that high performers can actually be anywhere from 18 to 24% more efficient than their peers. I know, interestingly, in Silicon Valley, they always talk about, the 10X programmer who purportedly is 10 times more productive than the worst performer. Who knows if that's actually true? But nonetheless, you say that the top performers are up to 25% more productive than colleagues. What are the key elements in having them do that? What does that mean? And what are they doing differently?
Yeah, great question. So at the heart of it, what I did was I was mapping all these analytics and seeing who are the people that are giving the greatest impact and taking the least amount of time in these places. So you could then find, I started out with 100 women, 100 men, to see, and through interviews, what are you doing? Exactly that question, right? How are you doing, in essence, getting back about a day a week of your time compared to your peers? And what I found in that is it's not one big thing. And that's what every publisher always wants, right? They want the one seductive, sexy principle everybody will remember. And this is not that game. It's more of a brawl than a ballet, right? People are fighting for their time on the margin, the more efficient people are. But they tend to do it in 3 categories of things. One is how they put structure into their work. So we could see there are 8 practices that tend to distinguish the more successful people. They're more likely to strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night with a 1 week or 3 month interval. in mind. They're more likely to block reflective time. They manage more to a rhythm of work that is optimal for them. They manage role interfaces differently ahead of demands coming at them. So there's very tactical things about how they're putting structure into their work. Secondly, they tend to be much more attuned to these triggers that lead us all to jump in when we shouldn't. And that was my biggest surprise, right, in all of this. I was absolutely sure when I started this that the enemy was out there, right? It was emails, time zones, nasty bosses, and ridiculous clients that were causing all this stuff on us. And I came out the other end completely convinced that we all have one or more of these 9 triggers that lead us to jump when we shouldn't. And it has to do with, for example, seeing leadership or being a good colleague is helping directly. Right. And so we jump in and solve problems and help situations, which is a great thing, but it creates us as the path of least resistance. And at some point, it becomes overwhelming. So what we're looking for in that section is really, are you aware of and guarding against that trigger? And then in the third section, there's 8 practices that are really about the efficiency of the exchanges themselves. So it's not so much email that kills us. It's the culture of use that we allow to persist around it. And what we see with the efficient collaborators is that they'll look at a situation and say, well, I can't control all email, right? Many people say, I can't control it all. I'm not going to try. They come at it differently. They'll say, look, my team generates 60% of the stuff that we are dealing with. And let's sit down and talk about it, right? Let's establish some norms of use around email, IM, meetings, cadences, and they get back very significant portions of time. But it's that kind of fight, right? It's on the margin that they're finding these opportunities to kind of steal back that time. And then in a minute, I want to make sure I then tell you what they go do with that time too, because that's just as important as not just getting it back, but kind of some of the things they do there. But those are the kind of 3 core strategies and then practices kind of underneath each of those.
I think that's fascinating. Thank you very much. And one thing that I'm hearing, which I think is both interesting and empowering, is be helpful, but not too helpful. Right, because if you were jumping in always, if I can fix that, I can solve that, then you are going to get more of that. So that's a very wise observation.
And the insidious thing, and it happens for different reasons, right? For some, it's a desire to help is huge. For others, it's preserving status, right? And in a group and things that maybe you were good at 5 years ago. For me, it's accomplishment, right? If I see 5 minutes of stuff, I'm going to try to jam 60 minutes of effort into it and ignore the 2 to 3 hours of meetings and emails I need to do to get alignment. And I wonder, like, gosh, how did that happen, right? And that's the nature of this. It's crazy, but we do it to ourselves. And a lot of times we don't experience that overload for 12 or 18 weeks later. And you're like, how did I get here, right? And the truly insidious thing about collaboration overload that's really unique and problematic is, of course, that it feels good right up until it doesn't. You know what I mean? You feel like you're in the thick of things. There's energy. People are responding off of you. This is a great thing right up until your significant other says no more, you lose an employee, or, that last straw kind of lands and things start to kind of unravel in there. So it's an interesting game, that people start with the idea in the book that this is a technical solution, and it isn't. Right. It's more about how you're putting structure and how you're managing your life a little bit differently today.
Yeah, really interesting point, and one that I resonate with a lot. I also, so we are book pals, Rob. Yep. Rob just came out last week with his book, Beyond Collaboration Overload, and I came out this week with my book, The Long Game, which very much is about long-term thinking and many of the practices that you're talking about in terms of strategic calendaring, in terms of really just kind of planning out where we want to go. So we have some great questions coming in from the audience, and I want to turn to them in a minute. But first, I'll just mention, if you are liking and enjoying this conversation, please hit the like and share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it as well. If you want to learn more about Rob Cross and his work, you can go to robcross.org. And if you want to learn more about my book, The Long Game, well, my goodness, you can go here, dorieclark.com/The Long Game. You can download a free Long Game strategic thinking self-assessment to help you with that. But so before we turn to our audience questions, Rob, you had dropped a teaser in, and you had mentioned that a really important point is not just that the successful people are ones who are better at planning their time, being a little bit more strategic around that, but also you said there was an interesting point about what they do with that time. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, that was a key thing we focused on. And to your point, again, this is a book really about what I call successful people do today. Looking at people that get and stay in the high performance category and are scoring higher on measures of thriving, resilience, well-being. So the idea is, are you kind of performing well and sustainable? And when you look at that, they're buying time back, through a lot of these activities on the margin, but then how they create and build networks gives them scale. So they're not taking that time and just doing more Zoom meetings faster, right? Or kind of more engaging in more just surface level interaction. What I could see in the work is, for example, there were about 20 to 25% more time spent in exploratory interactions with colleagues. So these were not a networking where you're going out and saying, I need a job, right? Or I've got a problem and I need help. They're just exploring early stage and saying, how could we do things together? And they're seeding relationships such that when the opportunity comes by, the people that have invested that time, their response is completely different, right? They're not responding just locally on what they know or the 3 people they turned to the last 20 times. They're actually thinking more innovatively. They're able to propose bigger solutions, and they win over time. It's the second biggest predictor we know of a high performer, not because of, indiscriminate networking, but because they're producing bigger things. And in the process of doing that, they're building a better network that then starts bringing them opportunities. So that's one thing. There's a couple of other things that we see with how the time is being spent, but at the heart of it, and I'm sure it's, similar with your book, I don't think we've been in a time in life where we could shape what we do and who we do it with more, but we give that up too quickly, right? And so it's the intentionality of that early stage exploration. Now, of course, what's the first thing that happens when we get overloaded? We stop exploring and we stop being expansive in that small moment. And so we lose that, you know what I mean? There's a real synergy between kind of how both sides of this work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'm right on the same page with you. As a point that I make in the long game is that it's not that it takes a huge amount of time to do long-term thinking, but it takes some, and you can't do it if you are filled to the gills. So I'm loving what you're saying. And Rob, I want to turn to a question from one of our listeners. They ask, what are the principles we need to be mindful of when we promote a more collaborative way of working in a silo-based environment? What implications do you see that overcoming collaboration overload dealing with external partners and customers in creating new business models? So there's a lot going on there. I would say in general, if you're in a very siloed environment, how do we think about collaboration in that context? And how can we think about collaboration and collaboration overload with regard to external partners? We'd love to hear your thoughts, Rob Cross.
Right. Well, to me, again, it comes back to preserving that time and being intentional about reaching out and exploring and possibilities. And so part of it depends on, what's driving the silo there in that context. And I'm really amazed. I mean, there's not too many organizations that don't come back today and say, we don't want creative thinking, right? Or we don't want one firm. I mean, it's agile, it's one firm, it's, all these things that are persistently saying we need collaboration kind of laterally in organizations. So a lot of it boils down to the person and them oftentimes not kind of reaching out in different ways. What I would see in this, and there's a collaborative overload diagnostic that people can see on the website as well and take for themselves, is one of the really critical things is having clarity on the capabilities you want to deploy in your work, right, in the coming 6 months, and values you want to experience, right? And that's not an abstract thing, right? It's being very clear on, do I like analytical work, do I like client-facing work, mentoring, whatever it is. And the more that people were clear on that, the more that they tended to structure in those explorations and find that time that they're just exploring and seeing what possibilities exist. I can't tell you, I just finished 200 interviews, 100 women, 100 men, focused completely on growth and well-being in work. And the way people do that, if they're systematic, they find themselves into work they want to be doing over time, over and over and over again. So that would be one thing that I would be thinking about tactically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that, Rob. Again, we're here with Rob Cross. He's the author of Beyond Collaboration Overload. And an interesting question, Rob, came in from Cheryl. She was curious. She wants to know about using some of this found time. If you are one of the strategic thinkers, the long-term thinkers that is actually able to fend off some of this overload, what is the value of using some of that time for self-care? Is that particularly helpful or valuable, or have you found anything about that?
Yeah, I think it's huge. You know what I mean? Is kind of looking for how you're creating interactions with others outside of work that pull you into those spheres, right? And so for some people, it may be activities around health. For others, it may be things that create a sense of purpose and meaning in life, right? It can come from different walks and different kinds of exploration, but it's absolutely critical. And to me, what I see is that the really happy people, they have a tendency to make more of the small moments, right? They tend to lean in very specific and intentional ways and get greater impact from that. So I could not agree more and emphasize that more as we go forward.
Yeah, that's great. And celebrating the small moments is such a powerful tool in terms of moving us forward and keeping up the momentum and persistence. So a question came in, Rob, from Annette. And Annette is curious if you can speak a little bit about identity issues and how identity issues factor into collaboration and collaboration overload.
Well, think I need to learn a little bit more about that one. Yeah, like in the sense, is it possible for Annette to come offline or to ask that question, or can we do that
Oh,
here?
that's a really good question. I don't think we can add her to the video very easily, but Annette, if you can type a little bit more in so we have a little bit more context about your question, that would be great, and we will come back to you.
Yeah,
We'd love to
that would
have
be
that. That
great.
would be great. In the meantime, Rob, one thing that I was curious about in your work, you talk about the concept of micro stresses. Can you
Right,
explain
right.
what that is and why that's an issue?
Right. So what I got so interested in early on was looking at kind of well-being and relational drivers and ways that people experience well-being as a product of the relationships they have around them. And what was fascinating to me is, every single book that's out there that talks about people that are happier over time or that are physically healthier, they talk about relationships as really central to that. But then they don't do anything about it, right? They don't. You have the connections or you don't. And so in these interviews, we started asking people, tell me about times in your life where you experienced really positive trajectories in your health or how you were happy at work and outside. And really, really super positive narratives, right, around the way they built and cultivated connections there. But I remember stopping on the very first one and I said, well, what got you in trouble to begin with? And it was a super vibrant conversation. And then it was just this pause. And they're like, I don't know. and they really reflected on it for a second. And they said, just life, I guess, that I kind of got caught up. And we really spent the next 45 minutes teasing that apart and really understanding that stress comes at us today in an entirely different way, right? We get hit with emails where we're sensing misalignment from colleagues, right? Or unambiguous message from a client, or we get touched by text from parents or children or whatever, where we can't tell, something serious or that they're, okay in the next moment. And so we accumulate through the day. We get hit with 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 of these relational touch points that create stress. We go home exhausted by the end of the day, and we can't quite put our finger on what just happened, right? And so I got really interested in that over time because it's a really different form of stress, right? It's not one big thing that's causing us problems. It's this really amazing accumulation of small that we're not wired to deal with. We remember the big things. We're not good at kind of pinpointing and thinking about where the small coming from and how do I adapt that over time.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you for that, Rob. And I want to build on that because one of the topics that's in the news so much these days, for understandable reasons, post pandemic, is lots of people are thinking about burnout as a topic. Now, obviously, excessive collaboration can be one of the factors leading to it, but you also suggest that there are positive and proactive ways that we could leverage collaboration to actually help fight burnout. Can you talk a little bit more about what that might look like?
Yeah, well, to me, when I look at it, it's using these tactics to see where is the stress coming from and understanding kind of two or three things that you can be proactive about in shaping the negative context, right? And the interactions that are draining you. And we just get used to working through them, right? It's kind of what people do today. And so I got really focused on that, but then also thinking about where are you placing investments of your time that enables you to become what I, would see with these 10 percenters, the people that were just flat out happier in their work. And what I can see in that is, again, it's the small things that if you really look at how you get a sense of purpose and meaning in your life, that the smaller interactions and getting more out of them matter. And we get a sense of purpose from others in different ways. And so last interview I was just on, this person was talking about, rather than running and going out for a personal 10K best time, what she started doing was running with her child, the child's friend, and a parent. And it pulled her into a set of interactions that were far more meaningful to her, right? And it's kind of like that. What we can see and what we're talking about in the end of the book is that the people that shift activities they're already doing to think about how do I create more meaningful relationships and more meaningful contexts, they tend to be the ones that are doing better. The ones that are pursuing kind of society's goal, right? The faster 10K time or the next promotion. At least today, they tend to not be doing as well from what I can see so far anyway.
Yeah, that's a really useful frame, and I think it ties nicely into Annette's question. Thank you, Annette. She dived back in. She said that Rob mentioned identity when talking about people losing what makes them happy and whole in social groups by being too busy to keep up with them. I was wondering if he saw other places where people were somehow impacting their identities, either positively or negatively. Does that help? And do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah,
Thanks, Annette.
so for me, thank you. So for me, what I would see is, people would really struggle when they were pursuing, for example, the next promotion as the only goal, right? That they would kind of oftentimes get there, and the interviewees over and over and over again would say, gosh, I got there and it wasn't what I thought. And so it tended to kind of, cause me problems more than kind of promoted happiness or health in there. So what I can definitely see is the people that, again, if I had one idea, I would print for everybody. It's kind of maintaining that dimensionality out there and having kind of 2-3 groups that create kind of a broader sense of who you are. That's really, really critical today. So and like really cool stories of how people do this. So Silicon Valley executive I spoke with recently, she was saying, she had a board of directors, right? Which a lot of people do. But for her, it was a completely different experience. She didn't go out and find 6 or 7 people that had the job she was going to. She went out and found 6 or 7 that showed up in life the way that she wanted to. And so it was younger, older, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different industries that she was coming from. And it was unbelievably cool. You know what I mean? She kind of crafted who she was and who she wanted to be in those interactions versus it being the same small set of people that kind of defined the social circle. So I think it's really critical, right? As we look at this and the dimensionality of how people do that matters for what I see in the happier people anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We probably have time for one more question. If you've been enjoying this conversation, make sure to check out Rob Cross's work. He's at robcross.org. His new book is Beyond Collaboration Overload. And if you have enjoyed our conversation, every Thursday we are here, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, and we are talking with great thinkers and authors. You can find out more by following me at dorieclark.com/LinkedIn. You can hit the follow button. You can subscribe to the Dorie Clark newsletter, and you will get regular reminders about all of these great chats. So, Rob, the last question that came in is Marion from Atlanta has a question, and he wants to know, in some contexts where collaboration is necessary, there's always that 1 or 2 people who don't want to participate. What can we do with that? And is there a way that we could actually start to get them engaged in some fashion?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, it's not perfect. You can't solve it all the time. But the kind of thing that I would see is people that got engagement. They were much better at backing away and looking for what's the commonality, right, that we both share, that we could both get engaged in. And as I looked at all the high performers, one of the really big things that surprised me was the degree to which they were more likely to seek out negative opinion leaders and people that kind of would be pulling in different directions over time, and pursue getting their alignment early. And so again, this is when I talk about how people were spending that time, we focus on this a lot in chapter 6, that creates a huge efficiency for these people downstream, right? Rather than perfecting the idea, then taking it out, where you have to do 5, 6, 7, 8 meetings to convince others. Suddenly they were getting done in 1 meeting what it was taking others 5 or 6 meetings. But the key was really very early stage in the framing of the problem, the framing of the project. They were much more intentional about thinking about where is that likely to happen and how do I go out and get engagement from people early. Again, the idea behind the book is this infinity loop where you're first buying time back and then looking to use it differently. If you haven't bought time back, one of the first things you don't do is look for those opinion leaders, right? Your head's down, you're building your team, you're just trying to get stuff done, and you don't get the scale, right? The same efficiencies there.
Yeah, such a good point. Thank you very much. We have been here with Professor Rob Cross. His book just released, Beyond Collaboration Overload. And Rob, it's a pleasure to talk with you again. You can find him at robcross.org. You can learn more about my just released book, which is very simpatico with Rob's. It's called The Long Game. You can find out more here. And we will see all of you next week. And Rob, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Dorie.